The picture you see in front of you is a picture of Fidel Castro. He just passed away within the past 24 hours. And the following clips are of politicians Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio, and their statements regarding Fidel Castro.
But all of the concessions that Barack Obama has granted the Castro regime were done through executive order, which means the next president can reverse them, and that I will do unless the Castro regime meets our demands. Those demands will include religious and political freedom for the Cuban people and the freeing of political prisoners.
Marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads, theft, unimaginable suffering, poverty, and the denial of fundamental human rights. While Cuba remains a totalitarian island, it is my hope that today marks a move away from the horrors endured for too long and toward a future in which the wonderful Cuban people finally live in the freedom they so richly deserve. And of course, that's a very different from Senator Ted Cruz. Let me read you what he says. He says Fidel Castro's death cannot bring back his thousands of victims, nor can it bring comfort to their families. Today we remember them and honor the brave souls who fought the lonely fight against the brutal communist dictatorship he imposed on Cuba. So just a ad from Senator Marco Rubio, who's of course been very critical of President Obama's actions in Cuba. He released a statement saying the dictator has died, but the dictatorship has not. And one thing is clear, history will not absolve Fidel Castro. It will remember him as an evil, murderous dictator who inflicted misery and suffering on his own people. So there again.
Now, those three gentlemen would have you believe that Fidel Castro was just as bad as Adolf Hitler. And nothing could be further from the truth. Let me give you a little history lesson on Fidel Castro. He was born in August 13, 1926 in Cuba. His father was a wealthy Spanish sugarcane farmer who first came to Cuba during the Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898. His mother was a domestic servant for his father's family who bore him out of wedlock. So his father was tiptoeing through the tulips with the hired help. Anyway, after he attended a couple of Jesuit schools, including the College of Belen, where he excelled at baseball, Castro enrolled as a law student at the University of Havana. While there, he became interested in politics and joined the anti-corruption Orthodox Party and participated in an aborted coup attempt against the brutal Dominican Republic dictator Rafael Trujillo. In 1950, however, Castro graduated from the University of Havana and opened up a law office. 2 years later, he ran for election to the Cuban House of Representatives. So he was attempting to try to work within the system. But guess what? That system was just as screwed as ours. That election never happened because Bautista, who was one of the main political people and also backed by the United States, seized power that March. Castro responded by planning a popular uprising from that moment on. He claimed he had a clear idea of the struggle ahead, as he stated in a biography that he gave in 2006. In July 1993, Castro led about 120 men in an attack on the Moncada Army barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Now, I know I said 93. I believe that was 1953. The assault failed. Castro was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison, and many of his men were killed. The U.S. backed Bautista, looking to improve his authoritarian image, subsequently released Castro in 1955 as part of a general amnesty. Castro ended up in Mexico, where he met his fellow revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara and plotted his return. The following year, Castro and 81 other men sailed on the yacht Granma to the eastern coast of Cuba, where government forces immediately ambushed them. The estimated 18 survivors, including Castro, his brother Raul, and Guevara, fled deep into the Sierra Maestro Mountains in southeastern Cuba with virtually no weapons or supplies. According to Castro, the revolutionaries started reorganizing with only 2 rifles, but by early 1957 they had already attracted recruits and winning small battles against rural guard patrols. We'd taken out the men in front, attacked the center, and then ambushed the rear when it was starting to retreat in the terrain we'd chosen, Castro said in his spoken autobiography. In 1958, Batista tried to snuff out the uprising with a massive offensive, complete with Air Force bombers and naval offshore units. The guerrillas held their ground, launched a counterattack, and wrested control from Batista on January 1, 1959. Castro arrived in Havana a week later and soon took over as prime minister. At the same time, revolutionary tribunals began trying and executing members of the old regime for alleged war crimes. Castro's rule. In 1960, Castro nationalized all U.S.-owned businesses, including oil refineries, factories, and casinos. This prompted the United States to end diplomatic relations and impose a trade embargo that still stands today. Meanwhile, in April 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and funded by the CIA landed near the Bay of Pigs with the intent of overthrowing Castro. Their plans ended in disaster, however, partially because the first wave of bombers missed their targets and a second airstrike was called off. Ultimately, more than 100 exiles were killed and nearly everyone else was captured. In December 1962, Castro freed them in exchange for medical supplies and baby food worth about $52 million. Castro publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist in late 1961. By that time, Cuba was becoming increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union for economic and military support. In October 1962, the United States discovered that nuclear missiles had been stationed there, just 90 miles from Florida, setting off fears of a World War III. After a 13-day standoff, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the nukes against the wishes of Castro, who was left out of the negotiations. In return, U.S. President John F. Kennedy publicly consented not to reinvade Cuba and privately consented to take American nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Cuba's life under Castro. After taking power, Castro abolished legal discrimination, brought electricity to the countryside, provided for full employment, and advanced the causes of education and healthcare, in part by building new schools and medical facilities. But he also closed down opposition newspapers, jailed thousands of political opponents, and made no move towards elections. Moreover, he limited the amount of land a person could own, abolished private business, and presided over housing and consumer goods shortages. With political and economic options so limited, hundreds of thousands of Cubans, including vast numbers of professionals and technicians, left Cuba, often for the United States. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Castro supplied military and financial aid to various leftist guerrilla movements in Latin America and Africa. Nonetheless, relations with many countries, with the notable exception of the United States, began to normalize. Cuba's economy floundered when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, and the United States expanded sanctions even further. Yet Castro, who by this time had switched his title from prime minister to president, found new trading partners and was able to cling to power until 2006, when he temporarily gave control of the government to Raul after undergoing emergency intestinal surgery. 2 years later, in 2008, he permanently resigned. In 2015, U.S. and Cuban officials announced they had agreed to terms on the normalization of relations between the two nations, with mutual embassies and diplomatic missions opening in each country. Now that was a history lesson, and there were a lot of people down in Florida, Little Miami, Little Havana, that are jumping up and down and celebrating the death of this man. And to be honest with you, if somebody had taken all my shit, I might be celebrating. As a matter of fact, I would be celebrating as well. But the majority of the people that had their stuff taken away from them, i.e., land, businesses, etc., a lot of these people basically backed the wrong side. They backed Bautista instead of backing him. Now, let me draw an analogy for you, because people are jumping up and down about him with the killing thousands with the firing squads, etc. Just recently, there was a coup attempt in Turkey, and the democratically elected president was out of the country. The military attempted to take over, and it lasted less than 24 hours. When the duly elected president of Turkey got back into country, because he was out of country at the time of the coup, when he got back in the country and he got things stabilized, what do you think he did? He started rounding up all of the people that plotted against him, and he executed them. Okay? There was no outcry from the United States, no condemnation of his actions. So that holier than thou attitude that the United States seems to have whenever their side loses, okay, and the other side wins, that's not going to cut it. Now, you can also see a similar pattern in the Ukraine when they finally kicked out the Russian-backed leader of the country, who may or may not have been democratically elected, but when he lost the last election, he ran for cover. He left the country because they would have executed him there as well. Now, back to history. The Bautista government that the United States backed was corrupt as hell. The mafia was down there, U.S. companies were down there. They were taking total advantage of the people of Cuba. And that's why Fidel Castro, after he attempted to work within the system and the Bautista government snatched power and canceled election, he basically had no choice. So he had to do what he had to do. But here we have the United States once again on the wrong side of something. When he got into his altercation with the Bautista government, that was a civil war. Why did the United States take sides? They took sides because of one thing and one thing only: money and power. They wanted to stay in power, and people were making a ton of money. Now, after Castro kicked Bautista out, Cuba still maintained diplomatic relations with the United States. Those relations were maintained until the United States attempted to assassinate him not once, not twice, but 3 times. How would you feel if somebody was trying to constantly kill you? I don't think you would have a really good feeling about that situation. Since the United States obviously didn't want him in power, he had very little choice. He went to the major adversary of the United States, which was the Soviet Union, and they were more than happy to welcome him with open arms because of the geographic location of Cuba. Well, then you have the Bay of Pigs, where the United States didn't have troops involved in the assault to try to get him out again, but they did supply military equipment and air support. All of that started back with Eisenhower, and he was the one who actually formulated the plan of getting Castro out. But it was John F. Kennedy who actually executed the plan to a point. There was an initial bombing run to go after Castro's forces, but when the light of day showed that the United States was trying to make a regime change, an illegal regime change, Kennedy backed away from it and discontinued the bombing runs. Well, all of the people, all of the troops that were on the ground, Castro basically whipped their asses, captured them, and then, because of the embargo that was in place, decided to trade the captured troops for $52 million worth of aid. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Castro was playing the Russians against the Americans, and that's why Castro allowed nuclear missile sites to be built on Cuban land. But both the Russians and the Americans saw the handwriting on the wall and knew that each of them had to back down. So the Russians decided to pull the nuclear missiles out of Cuba, and the Americans decided to pull their nuclear missiles out of Turkey. So basically, it was a draw between the two of them, though the missiles coming out of Turkey was a secret for a long time. All right, what has Fidel Castro done for the people of Cuba? Easily, he has restricted land ownership and business ownership, and nobody said that this guy was an angel. But two other things that he's done for the Cuban people, which I would render to say are outstanding things, are one, healthcare. The Cuban healthcare system is far superior to the American healthcare system, i.e., every citizen has a right to 100% healthcare for whatever they need. We don't have that. Number two, the entire educational system for every Cuban is free. So you go to grammar school, middle school, high school, university, it's all free. You are able to determine how far you can go educationally. Now, a little known publicized fact was Fidel Castro Fidel Castro fought against apartheid. He allied himself with Mandela, and there are pictures out there of Mandela with Castro once Mandela was freed. It's also not a really well publicized fact that during the AIDS outbreak, well, it wasn't AIDS, there was another medical outbreak over in Africa, that Fidel Castro sent a bunch of doctors over there to help with the outbreak over there. Now, the problem there was because there were no diplomatic relations, America had great difficulty in working with the doctors, but they figured a way out. So, again, there are a lot of people that have a right to be upset and angry about Fidel Castro because they got their stuff taken, but in my opinion, this man was doing what he had to do for the people of his country. He abolished basic racial or skin color, you can call it, discrimination. Did he have issues with homosexuality? He sure did, okay? just like a lot of Republicans in this country have an issue with homosexuality. Did he ban, I guess, free press, free media? Yeah, he did that. So again, like I said, he wasn't an angel, but one thing you can say, we reestablished diplomatic relations with Vietnam a hell of a lot faster than we have established diplomatic relations with Cuba. Cuba never invaded our country. Cuba basically only acted in self-defense for their own country, whereas we invaded both Cuba and Vietnam. Vietnam kicked our ass, the North Vietnamese, and yet and still we've established diplomatic relations with them, and just recently established diplomatic relations with Cuba, and we still need to remove that damn embargo because that's bullshit.